Well, 2 weeks ago, we learned that one of the keys to Daniel's thriving was that he had hope. He was a hopeful person. He didn't go through life just dejected and fearing what was coming next. He had hope. And then last week, we learned about his humility. He was a humble man, even though he was blessed by God. And this morning, appropriately enough on Mother's Day, we're going to look at the last thing that we can learn here, which is Daniel had a great deal of wisdom. He was wise. In doing so, we're going to focus on the 5th chapter of Daniel. So if you've got your Bibles, you can turn to Daniel 5. It's where the bulk of our sermon is going to be from this morning. And just as an aside, a little added bonus this morning. If you've ever heard the phrase, the writing was on the wall, and you wondered, where did that come from? It comes from this. So you get to learn that today. So beginning in verse 1, I'm going to go ahead and read through this so we can have a point of reference. I promise you it's not going to take an hour. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines, notice that it says that plural there, by the way, wives, concubines. We're not going to look at Belshazzar as the example of wisdom, just to make that clear. Okay? So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. You can imagine that would probably be kind of scary if over here behind Jerry on that wall, all of a sudden a hand started floating there. Not a person, but a hand, and just started writing over there where those flags are. I think we would all have a little bit of case of a knocking knees syndrome ourselves. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, leave it to the woman to come in and solve the problem. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what this writing means." So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I'll read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those that he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted, and those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from the people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox. And his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes." You might remember all that from last week. "But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold and of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see, hear, or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription." This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. Here is what those words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, which is the singular form of parsin. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Not a real happy interpretation there for him. But nevertheless, we go on. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple and a gold chain was placed around his neck. And he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in all the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. There is a lot there. There is a lot there. But to start, I think in order to learn from Daniel, we need to first understand what Belshazzar was all about. Multiple times we read that Nebuchadnezzar was his father. Now, most historians will say that he wasn't actually his father, but he was a descendant, and that the word that was interpreted here, it can, in fact, even in the footnotes in my Bible, it says that it could be interpreted to mean ancestor or predecessor. So, nonetheless, whether he's his father or whether he's a few generations removed, he is related to Nebuchadnezzar. He has to be familiar with what Nebuchadnezzar did, with the things that happened in his life and in his reign as ruler over Babylon. Even though he was familiar with them, though, he didn't learn from the mistakes of his predecessor. We see Daniel basically kind of point that out. Because what happened? He sees this hand appear on the wall. He sees something he can't understand. Who does he turn to? Well, the same people that Nebuchadnezzar did back in chapter 2 and, frankly, in chapter 1. So it's not a very bright line of people. The people that couldn't do it, the magicians, the astrologers, They couldn't figure out things for Nebuchadnezzar, but yet Belshazzar turned to them, seeking their wisdom, and seemed to have forgotten that the one who was actually wise, who actually provided answers to the king, was Daniel. These men couldn't interpret the dreams, but they were called into action. Then the queen entered the story, and she suggests, hey, you know what? These guys have failed many times before, but the guy who's successful, that's Daniel. Why don't you call him in here? He has an ability to solve the unsolvable. And that's an ability that we know is from the God of the universe. She says that he had an ability like the gods. But no, he had an ability that was from the God. And that brings about my first point here today. And that is, wisdom comes from God. Yes, Daniel had been named the head of the wise men when we look back at his history. However, he wasn't different due to having a superior talent or superior intellect, anything that he had developed. He was different because God worked in and through him. Daniel had studied the crafts of astrology, enchanting, and the rest, but he relied on God for his wisdom. When we look around the world, we see lots of people who are labeled as wise. In fact, I used Google, as one does in 2023, to look up, I searched for a list of the wisest people in the world. And unfortunately, the search engine showed me list after list. I know you were thinking that it was going to say there were no answers found. But it did show me lists, but they were all things like the 10 most intelligent people in the world, or the top 30 smartest people in the world of 2022. It was confused. Google was confused. Wisdom is not intelligence. And intelligence is not wisdom. It is possible to be intelligent and not be wise. I think there's a degree of intelligence that's required to be wise, but having a lot of knowledge doesn't mean anything about that. See, the very dictionary that I have sitting on my shelf said that the definition of wisdom is the quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment. So knowledge or intelligence only comprises 1/3 of the abilities that are required for wisdom to exist. So wisdom does require a degree of intelligence, and Daniel certainly had that. However, it's not enough to be smart. In a few weeks, many students across this nation are going to graduate from high school. And in recent weeks, in fact, I know just this weekend, IU East had their graduation, and there are lots of colleges graduating. There are certainly young adults who are graduating from there who have a ton of knowledge, who have a ton of intelligence. We'll find many, many intelligent students at these commencements. But we won't find very many who are truly wise. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's not sitting in judgment of them. It's just that wisdom requires a degree of life experience that most people don't have at that age. Now, I have met some, but they don't have much. I want you to do me a favor. You can close your eyes or leave them open, but picture the wisest person that you know. Think about who the wisest person is. Just out of fairness, take me out of the equation, okay? I didn't have to say that, did I? But picture the wisest person you know. I have a feeling that many of you might have pictured someone who looks similar, at least in age, to my choice here on the screen. This is Dr. Charles Munson. His friends called him Charlie. I couldn't do that. The closest I could come was to calling him Charles. See, Charles was my mentor. I was blessed that he was jokingly referred to as the Pope of the Brethren Church, the denomination that I grew up in. He was a professor at Ashland Theological Seminary for roughly 50 years. And then when he retired, he moved closer to his daughter who lived in Goshen, where I grew up. And he began attending our church. And when I sensed that God was calling me into ministry, I turned to him. And I told him one day, Charles, I think God's calling me into ministry. And he sat back at his desk. He was working as a volunteer at the church. He crossed his fingers, interlocked them, gave a big sigh, and said one of the most wise things I've ever heard. So you've tried everything else. And he went on to explain to me that if I could be happy doing something else, I should do that because I'm probably not called into ministry. And that ministry is a rough road. But there's no more rewarding than that if you're following the call of God. See, I was blessed. I had a man with so much wisdom that God placed into my life. It's fantastic. Because I wasn't wise. But I was able to drink from the same pool that he had to offer. He had that experience that I couldn't have had at that age. And I learned from that, and it helped me to grow more wise. The other thing that the dictionary said was that wisdom requires good judgment. We hope that our leaders are wise. I think our elders here display wisdom. I think Danny displays wisdom. Then I look to Washington. There's a lot of experience there, but sometimes we don't see that good judgment that exists. Politicians don't apparently have to have the good judgment all the time, regardless of their age. But Daniel was the total package. He was wise, which is so much better than just being smart. God gave Daniel the wisdom that was required to interpret dreams and to interpret the writing on the wall. But we consider that Daniel was likely around 80 years old at the time of this story. In a very practical fashion, God blessed Daniel with protection. The protection in order to live a long life during which he gained wisdom. So God gave him that wisdom in multiple ways. So wisdom comes from God, but also wisdom involves discernment. It's easy, in fact, it would be really easy to look at Daniel's early days in Babylon and be very judgmental about it. After all, what good man of God would spend 3 years studying the foreign culture of Babylon only to go on and become the head of all the pagan magicians and the sort? I mean, how many Christian kids, if we think back 20 years ago, how many Christian kids got in trouble just for reading Harry Potter? Daniel was basically attending a real-life Hogwarts of sort. He was learning magic. He was learning these pagan arts. And Daniel studied these things, but he never betrayed God. He knew that by studying these things and becoming becoming adept at the knowledge of these things, he would be able to fit in to that culture. And it would help him to have opportunities. But he never once betrayed God in doing so. He didn't believe any of this stuff that he was being taught. At the same time, though, he worked hard at it and he excelled in his studies. And he rose to a position that allowed God to use him in a mighty way, time and time again, to influence kings. And in order to do this, Daniel had to exercise discernment. He had to recognize that even though I don't believe this stuff, it's good for me to show my ability so God can use me. He did what was necessary to impress the Babylonians. And that allowed him to rise to the point of having influence on kings, but he refused to sell out his faith in the process. If we look in Daniel 1, verse 8, it'll be up on the screen here. He refused to sell out his faith. He refused the royal food that we talked about. It didn't abide by Jewish customs based on Levitical law. And it may have even been sacrificed to other gods, so he wasn't going to touch it. He used godly discernment to differentiate between the times that he should do what the Babylonians are asking for, and then also when he reached the point of non-negotiables. Turning his back on God's teaching and the Levitical laws and such was a non-negotiable for him. And that's what we need to know. We need to know what our non-negotiables are in this world. Especially today when truth seems to be in short order and truth changes from day to day as far as how the world interprets it. If we use the earlier illustration, some people may discern that reading books about a young wizard and his adventures was acceptable. But at the same time, they might decide that practicing wizardry or witchcraft, hopefully they would decide, that's not acceptable. There's a difference, and they exercise discernment there. Most of us are faced with these kinds of choices really on a daily basis. What entertainment do I consume? Who do we maintain relationships with? Can I keep working for this company when they're showing a tendency to exercise unethical practices in business? We can look to Daniel's example. We can prayerfully discern exactly how to live a life that is in the world, but it's not of the world. Some of these decisions may be different for different people. You may see things differently than I do. But when it's a non-negotiable, that's okay. Or that's not okay. When it's a negotiable thing, we have to use godly discernment to decide what those are. And that brings us to the last point of today. Wisdom involves humility. I know there's some of you that are sitting here and saying, whoa, Travis, Danny preached about humility last week. We got this. I don't want to be redundant on this. But the reality is, I can't ignore it, that a person must be humble to truly be wise. Arrogance and wisdom cannot exist together. All we have to do is take a look at the two kings that we've been seeing here. Between Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar, they were alike in that each one faced great consequences for their lack of humility. They suffered. They were destroyed because they weren't humble. And as rare as some of the qualities of wisdom can be in this world, today, humility may be the one that's in the most short order. I think there's always an argument, it seems like, in sports. I was really not gonna use any illustrations from athletics this week. But there seems to be an argument about who's the GOAT in anything. GOAT meaning greatest of all time. And I think one of the first rules I have is if you have to say that you're the greatest, you're not. And Ben knows exactly who I'm talking about. I think there was a documentary a few years ago called The Last Dance about the Chicago Bulls and their championship season of 1996, if I remember right. And in it, they showed Michael Jordan a video of LeBron James watching when he led the Cleveland Cavaliers to a championship. And he was watching that video with some friends, and he turned to them and he said, "Right there, that's the moment when I became the greatest of all time." And the look on Michael's face was priceless. Because if you have to say that you're the greatest, you're not. And does it matter? Does it matter? LeBron James is a great, great basketball player. So is Michael Jordan. Do I have an opinion about which one's better? Yep. But does it matter? Nope. Just like a lot of my opinions, they don't matter. Wisdom requires humility. And if we go through life trying to sound our own trumpet and make people understand how great we are, then we're not great. You see, the power that any of us have, even the power of these kings, it doesn't matter. Because it absolutely pales. Whatever accomplishments, whatever power we have, it pales in comparison to the power of Almighty God. And this was the greatest piece of wisdom that Daniel held. It's the greatest piece of wisdom available to anyone, to you or me, is that God is always greater. No matter how great I think I may be, I am nothing without God. I'm nothing when compared to God. Daniel understood this, and that allowed him to depend on God. And Daniel knew that God was the source of his wisdom. And so as we live lives of Christ followers today, we must strive to live lives of wisdom. God gave us a gift that Daniel didn't have. We have the example that his son lived on earth. Jesus Christ, by virtue of him being God himself, he carries the title of wisest man to ever live. We can follow him. We've got the gift of the letters in the New Testament. And in Ephesians 5, Paul gives us appropriate advice here, some instruction. When he says, "Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil." And as we live in modern day Babylon, there's no doubt that the days are evil. There's no doubting that. There's no doubt that we will face opposition as we seek to honor God with the lives that he gave us. If you're not facing opposition, then I would encourage you to Do a double take. Take a look at your life. Am I really living for God? Because Jesus found trouble when he was in this world, and he told us we will too. But we can take heart because he overcame the world, and so will we through him. There's no doubt that we live in a modern-day Babylon today. But if we're going to live in Babylon, then we can live like Daniel. We don't have to merely survive, but we can thrive as we live lives filled with hope, humility, and wisdom.